Thank you so much for joining. I'm really glad to welcome Silvio Lorusso to our 5th full round lecture of the spring semester. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Julian Bittiner and I'm senior critic and acting co-director with Susan Sellers of Studies in Graphic Design this semester. So I'm just going to provide a brief introduction, largely pulling on Silvio's very up-to-date website, which is very helpful. So very glad to have Silvio with us. Silvio's a writer, an artist, a designer based in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. He's an assistant professor at the Center for Other Worlds of the Lusófona University in Lisbon, a creative coding tutor at the Royal Academy of Art in The Hague, and he's been a lecturer in the design department of the Sandberg Institute in Amsterdam. Silvio's work engages and combines a very wide variety of media, including video, websites, artist books, installations, and lectures, which he describes as, quote, focused on the cultures and rhetorical regimes embedded in techno-social systems, unquote. And in addition to this studio work, he also writes, curates, and organizes public programs and symposia. In 2018, he published his first book entitled Entreprecariat, Everyone is an Entrepreneur, Nobody is Safe, which was published, second time was published by Onomatopoeia. He's a member of Varia, the Center for Everyday Technology, a Rotterdam-based initiative, and is on the editorial board of the Italian graphic design magazine Progetto Grafico. That's my attempt to pronounce that correctly. His work's been shown at a number of prestigious venues, including Maxi in Rome, Transmedial in Berlin, the Photographers Gallery in London, the Kunsthalle in Vienna, and he currently has work on view in a show called Virtual Bodies at the Tokyo University of the Arts, as well as another exhibition in Lausanne, Switzerland. And his writing has appeared in numerous magazines and public volume, Real Life magazine, Not, and Modes of Criticism. So with that, please join me in welcoming Silvio, and thank you again, Silvio, for joining us today.
Yeah.
Looking forward.
Thanks. Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here. A bit shaken because like I had quite some time to prepare. No, I was invited like months ago, so I took a bit the chance to connect, entangle some of the threads that I've been working with. So let me share my screen so you can see more or less what. Like at least the slides. Please, can anyone confirm that you can see my screen? Yes.
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, nice. So yeah, the topic of today, what I want to speak about today is a bit like of let's say a European perspective on the art and design school. This comes after like 5 years of teaching and way more years of like studying. And I came to certain ideas, a certain set of ideas which I'm trying to combine in this presentation. Of course, yeah, as Julian was saying, like my work in the last years has been focused on the very notion of work or labor. And how do I see that? How do I see work? I have like three meanings of this word which are dear to me. So of course, the work is an activity that we do. Then there is a set of relationships that are with some people with more power on others. And finally, and this is like the most important part in my work, has been like to highlight the mythical aspect of work, which is like the story that we tell each other and to ourselves. The narrative, the professional narratives that we adopt when we identify ourselves. So one of the driving forces, let's say, moving my work has been this idea that realism somehow includes idealism. So ideas are part of reality, are things that shape this reality, are not just representation of reality. So normally when one speaks about work, one speaks about that phase, the dimension that comes after school. And in this case, I would like to reshuffle this perspective by stating that the school is the real world. And I'm going to try to convince you, to persuade you that this is the case. And I'm going to use a couple of references to do so. The first one is Enzo Mari, a famous Italian designer, legendary, pioneeristic Italian designer, who has been very focused on the class aspect of society. He was a Marxist, a communist, very explicitly. And well, at a certain point in his life, he started to reflect on the design school, and he started to say that you know, if we take like the design degree as a product, we can legitimately consider the design schools as like one of the biggest, if not the biggest, industries of within the field of design. So already within the school, like the reasons of the market interacts with, and I'm quoting again Mari, the hopes, the strategy, and even the naivete of future designers. But of course, there are like other reasons which are even more alarming to consider the school as like a sort of part of the so-called real world. Of course, we see nowadays, and this is becoming way more clearer, that the problems of students are not so different fundamentally from the problems of workers. So, for example, in the Netherlands, we have seen recently a surge of protests against like the rising prices and the difficulty of finding affordable housing in the country. And so basically, those issues together have an impact on the very perception of what the school is. And I would argue that the more like the uncertainty, the more the prism of investment, which is like a transactional prism, comes to the fore when we look at education. An example of this. This is a poster by an Italian artist who studied at DAMS, which is like an experimental school of the arts, where Umberto Eco was teaching. And he made this poster in which he said, okay, this poster is worth around 50,000 euros that my parents have spent in order to make me get a degree at DAMS, instead of buying a luxury German car. So you see like how the prism can be a bit cynical and really transactional in a way. So as a response to this, we see like a reemergence of institutional critique, which is something that we are used generally to locate in the world of art in relationship to museums. So now in design schools, I think that there is emerging a new form of institutional critique that is way more like self-oriented, that look at its own institutions. So during the pandemic, for example, in the Netherlands, there has been like a the emergence of a network of anonymous, semi-anonymous Instagram accounts that ironically, but also very seriously, address issues, concerns regarding both the staff, the students, and the infrastructures of education. So I can really relate, for example, to this this meme here by VDK teacher memes. Of course, this hasn't been like the first time in history that we see this kind of institutional critique born within the schools, within university, within academies. In the so-called long 68 that goes from the 68 to the 77, like these two moments of like global protests in education. We saw that was already emerging a certain sensitivity towards toward this topic. So for what we see in this picture is like students in Bologna, if I remember well. So again, in the same city. And what the graffiti that we see in the background reads: "The university is a garden where unemployed flowers blossom." Again, like this transactional look and this focus on very material concerns like employment, right? Someone who, let's say, analyzed these protests was Giancarlo De Carlo, an architect that was already very open to listen to the students, because his work was focused on co-participation, on horizontal structure, and so on. So he was describing the students as like accidental extraneous passenger in an institution that should be made for them. But actually is not actually seeing them. But this was similar also to what was happening to the temporary teaching staff, that also were somehow disoriented and looking for some sort of concrete configuration. But we also had another kind of demand from the students, which I think is beautifully and clearly articulated in this slogan, which is "Vogliamo pensare," which means we want to think. It's a very simple slogan, but a very strong one. So if we listen to the students themselves at the time, they were saying like, look, it's not that we just need that the university addresses like the labor demand in society, but also that the university offers critical tools. Of course, this required a sort of full restructuring of what the university was and is, and of course not fully successful at the time. So how to combine these two lenses, the lenses of employment, of skills, etc., with the lenses of critical thinking, of emancipation? I would propose, like, I would say that more or less like the perspective on education, the criticism of education can be summarized in various sub-branches. So on one side, you have the realists that say, yeah, schools is for the labor market, is to produce professionals, to create skills, and so on. And on the other side, you have like the people who focus more on the idealist side of school. And within these, you find both like pessimists and optimists. The optimists believe in the possibility of developing critical thinking, emancipation, liberation. An example of this is Bell Hooks, for example. And on the pessimist side, you have like picturing of the school as like a place in which discipline takes place, brainwashing, that is only on paper is an egalitarian space. An example of this perspective is M.A.H, who was against the very institution of the school. He was saying like, let's abolish this institution. So how to combine these two, I mean, this series of criticism towards education in a sort of comprehensive model. And why to do this? I would suggest to do this because certain questions are a bit more, might be a bit more complicated. So for example, are we really sure that the professionalizing school cannot be liberating, or that emancipation can be a sort of a form of discipline in certain cases? The way I somehow engage with this discussion is by looking at the work of Pierre Bourdieu, French sociologist. As you can see, was like a bit obsessively creating diagrams in which he would connect like what people listen to, like Georges Brassens, to the party that they would vote for, or even the sport they would play, in order to create a nuanced understanding of taste and how this taste relates to class. So what is the school for Bourdieu? For Bourdieu, the school is a market. market in which sense? In the sense that within the school, cultural capital is formed, of course, and this is obvious, but also exchanged and even more legitimized or sanctioned. So basically, if you start thinking this way, you realize that nobody arrives at school empty-handed at every level. So everybody has some sort of inheritance of cultural capital that can be even negative, can be, for example, bad manners, let's say an accent that doesn't sound good, that doesn't sound proper, no? And the educational institution, in a way or another, tacitly or explicitly, it weights this inheritance, no? So the emancipatory aspect of the school can be present and are often present and should be present in the ambition of the students, the staff, etc. But it's very hard. It's harder to somehow break the legitimizing mechanism that is often implicit and hidden, that somehow legitimize or sanction those very ambitions that can be either conservative or progressive, let's say. So what kind of legitimation takes place? I think that there is something to do with let's say the production of the self, the idea that you go to school to become who you are. This is a Nietzschean slogan, aphorism, let's say, and you can see how in art and design education it appears. So for example, this is an Italian ad for the Accademia del Lusso in Milan, which literally says, "Become who you are." So I say we here also because I speak of myself as an educator, like being part of this this context. I think we insist often on this idea of authentic, of the authentic self, of what like only you and you only can do. So there is a rhetoric of authenticity. There is a bit of a let's say a tool to let's say to legitimize a certain production of the self. So I would propose here to consider these two branches of design, let's say. Of course, we are used to think of the design of things. We are less used to reflect on like or at least make explicit the way in which the self is produced within art and design schools and schools in general. So we need to start by considering the fact that self-design is like one of the key facts of modernity, in the sense that it's an opportunity and a course, actually. Because since there is no predestined path for most of the people, anyone and everybody is somehow asked and demanded to design their own trajectory. Of course, certain trajectories are more elastic, there are more possibilities, and some other are more rigid. But the possibility to shape this trajectory is a fact that can be somehow generalized. And we see how this this connection is somehow emerging also in a certain subgenre of literature. We see how much, let's say, the self-help culture is being connected to design literature, to creating so a sort of a hybrid genre of design self-help is emerging. This is just one book among many. And I think that there is like some risks in emphasizing too much like the self-design aspect. Somehow the self-reflexivity, which is a defining feature of modernity, can become, let's say, extreme, can become pathological, can become like a bad autofiction somehow. And the risk is that by emphasizing that too much, you have a sort of mirror image of the liberatory school of Belux. So the focus on the self, on the expression of the self, can become a sort of shortcut to outsource somehow the definition of content and what's matter, what's urgent to students themselves. So this is a bit of a risk I see. And of course, this discussion on identity, on the self, was already somehow was already discussed again by some observers like Rob Giampietro, who was also emphasizing a bit this this analogy between the design school and the creative writing school. So with a sort of autobiographical turn. So how does this idea of the self-design connects to professional aspirations? Design, we all know this, it's a protean entity. So it includes, it embeds both the charisma of the master, the kitsch of the star designer, the nostalgia of the craftsman, the pride of the expert, and even more increasingly, I would say, the struggle of the work. And I will focus in particular on this a bit later on. So again, paraphrasing Bourdieu, we can say that since design is like a fluid and confusing field, it allows from professional goals that are also somehow fluid and confusing. And in a way, there is something interesting there, because this is functional to a social configuration, in the sense that the aspiration that the new professions like design give to that afford are never completely realized nor completely frustrated. So it's not a game that you can clearly win or lose. No, there is always a margin, a leverage for becoming someone else, no, or moving to another subfield and not be really clear where you place yourself. So this is also functional in terms of certain ambitions, in the sense that design offers this space in which you don't lose the quality of what is socially perceived as a real job, but also you might get, if you're lucky, certain symbolic benefits, the prestige of culture, basically. So in a way, you could say that if the modernist diktat in the past was less is more, now we could somehow speak of this vagueness in the form of more or less, no? And that's function, and this part and parcel of contemporary design culture. So something I've noticed is that professionalization doesn't really matter anymore. So it seems it wasn't like this 10 years ago. The discussion was really much on the notion of professionalization. Now it sounds like a bit of a dusty, passé type of topic. And I would like to give you a bit of an example of this. And then I want to try to be very precise on this, because there is the risk of taking these words out of context. So Aggie Toppins was recently writing on the IG, on Ion Design, that that professionalization is no longer a big an imperative of the field. What's more important is to make design practice a responsible practice. Aggie Toppins is speaking from the perspective of history. So she's very correct in saying that professionalization historically, and even more like historiographically, is established. Now, most people will believe, will know, without having to do any kind of propaganda, that design is a profession. But it's also interesting how does she demonstrates this. And she says, like, it's under everyone's eye that graphic design, for example, is an in-demand college major. So confirming a bit what Enzo Mari was saying about the biggest industry of design. And of course, Aggie Toppins is making also a very important claim that the mechanisms of professionalization have been historically excluding both women, minorities, oppressed groups, non-Western people, and so on and so forth. But I would like to scrutinize a bit more here, like what do we mean by profession and what is the actual state of the profession? Okay, I wasn't so sure to put this because it's a bit demagogic. I'm saying, of course, this is a Fiverr.com ads that sort of devalues the knowledge of the profession. And so you can see how it could be seen that culturally the profession of graphic design, for example, is attacked. But there are like more alarming ways to look at the problem of professionalization. For example, this was a study done in the UK, a pretty big study that shows the following. Yes, design is like the most popular choice for bachelor, right? But 1 out of 4 of the people who study design don't end up working as designers. Okay, this could make sense. I mean, you do other things. For example, I also don't work as a designer, but it's not just that. They don't end up, if you read the subtitle, into highly skilled design jobs, which means that they don't end up as professionals. So I think that, this also resonates with older discussion about the practice and how the influences of tools and technology on the professional field. Generally, this is like framed as a sort of feud, of course, and of course not an official one, but between two very well-known historians, so Stephen Heller and Ellen Lapton. So for our convenience, Ruben Pater, in his new book Caps Lock, has somehow summarized the position, so it's really convenient. So basically, Stephen Heller is like, okay, desktop publishing software is devaluing our profession. We lose the elite status that gives us credibility. Ellen Lapton says, well, actually, desktop publishing has made the field bigger rather than smaller, and made it also more popular. So I think, of course, it's pretty hard to sympathize here with Stephen Heller. And why? Because he's using a word that is cursed, and the word is elite. But I think the word elite really deserves some sort of investigation to actually see how it relates to the notion of profession. Based on at least like that UK study, I think that when if we apply that Bourdieusian lens of conversion of cultural capital, well, then we have a problem. Then there is a problem. It's a problem that you cannot really ignore, and it's a problem that weighs on institutions. So what is an elite? What is a profession? To speak of professional elite is some sort of tautology, because if we let's follow this definition by Donald Schoen, who is a philosopher. No? He says, like, the professional claims extraordinary knowledge in matters of human importance, well, whatever that is, getting in return extraordinary rights and privileges. So in a way, a profession, it's ugly to say, but is an elite by definition. Is like has like this extraordinary, or at least like pretend and convince others that it has like extraordinary knowledge. Of course, rights and privilege doesn't sound good, but we also have to see it in an informal way. Of like the I would say extraordinary recognition. Yeah, that would be a bit more acceptable as a definition. So I think much of this problem of professionalization and the losing the position of elite has to do with the two different dimensions. One is a common one. in this design is like always been very much focused on its own perception, the perception that designers have of themselves. So what we call proprioception is a technical word, but it means like, yeah, self-perception. Less has been done, I think, in terms of perception, outer perception of like taking seriously what this perception from the outside is. And I think this perception has a big impact on this capital conversion from cultural to economic. So look, for example, at this statistic. You have here UX designers who are paid more or less double than graphic designers. Of course, both graphic designers and UX designers have a wealth of knowledge, but there is like a difference in perception of this knowledge and this expertise. A bit because like the UX designer has this mystique, no, we don't know yet very much what they do, no? While the graphic designer's knowledge is somehow demystified, at least on paper, no? Everybody sort of knows what graphic design is. You don't need to have like a master in graphic design to know that. While UX designer maintain a degree of esotericism that is probably functional in terms of this capital conversion. So this leads us to the question of like how to understand economic responsibility. Again, in the Netherlands, there are like very several organizations that are like active with taking this question seriously, basically. One of them is Platform BK, who has recently published a letter, an open letter, which I signed very eagerly, about like a future agency. And the letter was previously called was speaking about the economic responsibility of art academies in the Netherlands. So the problem we have here is that how do we actually define economic responsibility? What I try to show in this very long introduction is that economic responsibility is not just invoices, it's not just financial literacy, but it's really like fluctuations of cultural capital, symbolic capital. And it's hard to work with this material because it's very ethereal somehow. So a reaction that I see right now, because the problem is present, is like a sort of mindset, is to present the designer class as an exploited proletariat. Don't get me wrong, this is very true. In many cases, there is forms of exploitation. There are like unpaid internships. There are like unpaid jobs. There are like terrible conditions. There is harassment. There is like there is like really bad situation that justify this lens. But we have to see also when this mindset is like somehow embedded within educational organization, educational institution. And I think there, in that case, we deal with a sort of double bind. Students are somehow educated to think like professional, like professionals, but at the same time they are somehow asked to develop a sort of proletarian awareness. And the risk is that by expanding this lens, that the kind of resentment, the rightful resentment that many students or like emerging designer have, this is turned somehow into, is repackaged as a material for courses and syllabi. That's why I would suggest, what I think is that this mindset should be there, like the class analysis, but should be somehow minoritarian, should be a small part of programs. So we see, for example, in this poster by the Rodina, a bit like the double bind in action. So you have like the unionized slogan syndicalist slogan, workerist slogan, which is matched with the very face, the individual face of one of the studio members, as well with some keywords that have to do with the let's say the deployment of certain political ideas. So, for example, they speak often of performative design. So you have like this kind of combination that that is in itself contradictory, but maybe it's a good, valuable contradiction that we have to entangle, disentangle somehow. And much has to do with the notion, the position of the designer within the cultural discourse. Ellen Lapton, in the very book that I mentioned before, like where she was speaking about this idea of the field expanding, was suggesting that the designer would be considered, would become organic intellectuals. No, the term is like it's inspired by Antonio Gramsci, of course, and their skill would be both technical and theoretical. I think like professional and elite, also intellectual, I believe is a term that deserves certain scrutiny, And luckily, I didn't have to do all the job by myself, because was a designer himself who dedicated like a full book, unfortunately only in Italian, on the notion of the intellectual. And this designer is Tomás Maldonado, Argentinian born, director of Ulm, which is sort of Bauhaus 2.0, and a design theorist as well. So by looking at the history of the notion of the intellectual, Maldonado highlights certain features. So, for example, the fact that the intellectual is never neutral, they take position. They sign manifestos, and from Montaigne on, they are somehow radically reflexive. No, they are modern, they are self-focused somehow. But when speaking about designers specifically, Maldonado came up with this sort of oxymoron definition, like the designer as a technical intellectual. Giovanni Anceschi, one of his students at the time, explains what is like the theoretical move to speak of a technical intellectual, is to say that basically we are used to think of two cultures, science versus humanism, engineers versus philosophers, no? And Giovanni Anceschi say, look, Maldonado, with this definition, was trying to say that there is no two cultures, that there is theory in practice and practice in theory. And it's very hard to disagree with this statement. But again, like perceptions, ideas, spread idea are a strong force in society. And so I wanted to make like a small experiment to test how much the Maldonado's definition actually works in practice. So basically, I did this survey asking, I did it in Italian, and probably in different languages, in different contexts will be different. But this is what I have. Basically, I asked 4 questions. Would you agree that designers are creative, artists, intellectuals, and technicians? Or technical? Yeah, it's not exactly translatable. So as you can see, creative, artists, and technicals are very clear. The answer is a clear yes, basically. There is little doubt. But when we go to the intellectual, so bottom left, the doubts are very clear. Now they emerge like it's a 30% yes, 30% no, 36%, even the majority, I don't know. So we see that somehow this good, nice proposition of both Lapton and Maldonado is somehow not totally received in society. And not only that, but we have to ask ourselves, so what do we mean by technical? By what does that mean? Again, I would like to quote Bourdieu. And at a certain point, he speaks about what is a technician. And he defines a technician as someone who, as an executor who doesn't have real economic, political, or cultural power. I think we all have somehow a bit of experience with the position of the executor in small jobs or even big jobs. So I think it's very important to state a difference between two different terms. So the technician has this executing quality, but then there is the technologist, and the technologist actually can be a legitimized, a recognized synthesis of the two cultures. And we see a bit in the debate, even within UX design and service design, that this is really the current struggle, the current fight somehow. This fight goes under the label of the seat at the table. So designers are asking, have been demanding for a seat at the table. And we see in this humorous strip like the problem of the technician versus the technologist. So when finally the designer gets the seat at the table, they are asked to fix the projector. No, so you get very directly what's the difference between these two positions, these two, yeah. So my sensation is that the designer didn't fully manage to position themselves authoritatively within the sphere of techniques. So in a way, like the humanist turn, the theoretical, the critical turn is somehow not just like a choice, like a deliberate choice, but also at least partly sort of necessity of making virtue out of necessity. And yeah, I think like this slogan shows a bit, this is the title of a book written by Mieke Gerrits and Gert Loving, it's published in the Netherlands. It shows a bit like what the technical intellectual really turned out to be. The place of the action is really seems to be really like China or California, or like specific parts in the let's say in the global north, and Europe very often is left with the space for like criticism. So in a way, if the desire was for a technical intellectual, but in the end, maybe what we are dealing with is more like an intellectual of techniques, a sort of social conscience of like the limits of techniques and technology, basically. So, of course, one of the most blatant, most known example of this shift is like the critical design current, right? And we can see in the funding manifesto of the current that there was this humanistic shift. For example, you see for design for production to design for debate, from make us buy to make us think, from ergonomics to rhetoric. So what we see here, what we deal here is somehow a recuperation of the traditional intellectual that the humanistic intellectual that Maldonado was describing. And this current, which is not just a current, but is a set of ideas, really had a profound impact on pedagogy. And this, for example, is like a collage of descriptions of projects at Design Academy Eindhoven. You can see that the notion is like raising awareness. So probably the main activity of the intellectual of techniques is like raising awareness. And of course, this form of expression has its own limitation, especially when you know, designers are competing with the raise of awareness by means of by most spectacular means, like for example, think of social media. the problems with social media. Probably we got like way more awareness from a problematic documentary, which is The Social Dilemma, that from thousands of critical projects about social media. And also you can see a bit the limit of the raising awareness model. So the sense of speculative and critical design and all the critical subcurrents or like, other currents is that somehow it solves the problem. And the problem is the very problem of access to problems. So by creating fictions, you have a chance to become autonomous, to disconnect from the concretely social dimension of technology, what was historically called the technostructure, which is not just the devices, the things, but really the social dimension of it, like the CEOs, the policymakers, the executives, those who have like that kind of decision-making power. So I think we have to interpret this new sentiment against problem solving also as a result of the actual possibilities of accessing problems.
Silvio,
yeah,
I just wanted to let you know maybe about 10 more minutes before we open it up for questions, if that's okay.
Perfect, perfect. It's exactly the time I need. Thank you so much, Julian. So yeah, I have another couple of chapters of this presentation. Now, so connecting a bit to this idea of the positioning of the design, of the intellectual, we also deal with an issue with the social conscience, with the question of ethics somehow. Alison J. Clarke, which is a British historian, clarifies a bit the issue. She says, like, look, within the field, we have been a bit binary about what how we consider ethics, how we consider design. So on one side, we have like this sort of neo-Marxist paradigm. So on one side we have, let's say, the virtuosity of an ethical design practice, so sustainable, socially embedded, etc. And then on the other side we have profit, we have capital, we have Jeff Bezos, right? We see that there are like certain limits in putting the enemy out there so in such a binary way, and it has, again, like, those things are not just value, an expression of values, but they are very functional to the discourse of design itself. So let's see, for example, the work of J. Dakota Brown, who studied the manifestos like First Thing First. Speaking of the 2000 version, he basically he realized that if the initial goal was to contest the design as an institution of power, suddenly there was a shift, and the shift was like an affirmation, even apolitical, of the so-called power of design. So what are we witnessing here with this idea of design ethics? We have a strange, a bit perverse mechanism of self-aggrandizement by means of over-responsibility. Again, like, the most blatant example is, I think, like the book Ruined by Design by Monteiro, which you find like this line, for example: design is also a craft with a lot of blood on its hands. Every cigarette ad is on us. Every gun is on us. Yeah, well, I didn't know that. And I'm not sure that's the case, to be honest. So my invitation is a bit like following the Institute for Technology and Public Interest, is to focus less on ethics and more on politics. So if ethics is a sort of an athletic form that is also functional to this project of the design of the self, since it gives like a sort of positionality within the spectrum of even competitors in the field. So you can use ethics also as a sort of to present yourself within a moral vanguard, no? And that's what designers have been doing recently, no? Politics is more of a physics. No, it's more about looking, as I tried to do in this presentation, a bit conflictual and even self-deceptive motives that guide certain trends, certain currents, certain actions, basically. Final part, hysteresis and compromise. A difficult term by Bourdieu, hysteresis. But it means something very simple. So it means applying an obsolete perspective to a now changed context. So to look the present with the lens of the past. We see this when you know, like students are asking for opportunities to a teacher who has not been working in the field for you know, for a decade. So there has been a concept that has shaped a lot, let's say, design education, and specifically graphic design education. The idea of critical autonomy. No, this idea that graphic design would somehow generate meaning out of its own means. No, how do you say it in English? Like racing by your bootstraps. No, that kind of expression. But we see that the problem of autonomy is that autonomy is also autonomy from history. No, it's also a disconnect to the can be also a disconnect to the current condition, the actual limitations in terms of what can be done in the light of the other people's perception. So yeah, this is what how people are like representing autonomy nowadays. So I want to conclude really by going back to Anceschi and Maldonado. So speaking of the technical intellectual, they have like this very nice definition, this beautiful definition, which includes a bit of all the words that I've been mobilizing. So the stoic and realist art of design compromise. So I would like to focus on the word compromise. And since it's like the actual conclusions, I would like to read it if you allow me. So it's, yeah. So design compromise is the antithesis of critical autonomy. It is an admission of the fact that the designer is, after all, inevitably a bricoleur. In other words, they who make they who make do with what they find in the conditions in which they find themselves. Design compromise is not for this reason docile or victimistic, but it is also critical. It is critique of compromise, awareness of the reasons that guide awareness. It is, the reasons, yeah, that guide, well, yeah, I got a bit lost. The ability and courage to distinguish the past from the present. Refining the art of design compromise means taking note of the compromission of the school as an integral part of the real world. It means overcoming one's own professional proprioception in order to come to terms with others' perceptions of one's role, especially when these turn out to be unpleasant. Thank you so much.